American gunners in World War II were doing something that sounds completely insane. They were aiming behind enemy aircraft, not at them, behind them. And somehow this backward strategy made them twice as deadly as anyone else in the sky.
During the height of World War II, Allied bomber crews noticed something weird. American gunners were racking up kill counts that seemed impossible. German and Japanese pilots who had survived encounters with British bombers were getting shredded by American ones. The difference wasn't better guns. It wasn't more ammunition. It was where they were aiming. And when you first hear about this technique, it sounds like the dumbest thing you could possibly do in combat. But there's actual science behind it. Science that changed aerial warfare forever. Picture this. You're a gunner on a B-17 Flying Fortress, 30,000 feet above Germany. It's 1943. The temperature inside your turret is -40 degrees. You're wearing electrically heated suits just to avoid frostbite. Your oxygen mask is freezing to your face, and then you see them. Black dots on the horizon, Messerschmitt fighters, coming in fast. These fighters are closing in at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. That's almost 1,000 feet per second. You've got a .50 caliber machine gun that fires rounds at around 2,800 feet per second. Sounds fast enough, right? Wrong. Here's the problem that was killing Allied gunners in the early years of the war. They were doing exactly what their instincts told them to do. They were aiming directly at the enemy aircraft. Point and shoot, just like shooting a stationary target at a range. And they were missing, over and over again, wasting ammunition, getting their planes shot down, dying. British bombers in 1941 and early 1942 were being massacred over Germany. The gunners would see a fighter coming in. They'd track it with their guns, put the crosshairs right on the fuselage, squeeze the trigger, and watch their tracers fly harmlessly behind the target, every single time. The Germans and Japanese weren't stupid either. They figured out pretty quickly that Allied gunners couldn't hit them if they kept moving. So they developed tactics based on this. High-speed passes, constant movement, never fly straight, never give them an easy shot. And it worked. Bomber losses were catastrophic. In 1942, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a rate that was unsustainable. Some missions saw loss rates above 25%. That means 1 in 4 bombers that took off didn't come back. And most of those losses were from fighter attacks. The gunners were brave, they were willing, but they couldn't hit anything. The math was brutal. If you flew 25 missions, which was a standard tour of duty, your chances of survival were basically a coin flip. And a huge part of that was because defensive gunnery just didn't work. Pilots knew it, crews knew it, command knew it. Something had to change. The situation was getting worse every month. The strategic bombing campaign was the entire point of having heavy bombers. The Allies needed to destroy German industrial capacity. Oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, railroad yards. But if the bombers couldn't survive the trip to the target and back, the whole strategy fell apart. Commanders were looking at the numbers and panicking. At the current loss rates, they would run out of trained crews before they ran out of missions. Young men were being sent up in aircraft that were essentially flying coffins. The life expectancy of a bomber crew member in early 1943 was measured in weeks, not months. And here's the thing that made it even worse. The bombers themselves were incredible machines. The B-17 Flying Fortress could take insane amounts of damage and keep flying.
There are stories of B-17s coming back with massive holes in the fuselage, entire sections of the tail blown off, engines destroyed. They were tough aircraft, but they couldn't survive if the defensive guns didn't work. Each B-17 had 13 .50 caliber machine guns. That's more firepower than most fighter aircraft had. In theory, a formation of bombers should have been able to put up a wall of lead that nothing could penetrate. In practice, those guns weren't hitting anything. The gunners were firing thousands of rounds and maybe getting lucky once or twice per mission.
So what was going wrong? Why couldn't trained gunners hit enemy fighters? The answer is something called deflection. When you're trying to hit a moving target from a moving platform, you're not shooting it where the target is. You're shooting it where the target is going to be. Because your bullet takes time to travel, and during that travel time, the target keeps moving. Think about throwing a football to a receiver who's running down the field. You don't throw it at where they are. You throw it to where they're going to be when the ball gets there. You lead the target. Aerial gunnery is the same thing, except the speeds are insane, the distances are huge, and the closing rates are trying to kill your brain. Let's do the actual math on a typical engagement. Say an enemy fighter is coming at you from the side at 400 miles per hour. That's about 587 feet per second. Your position in the bomber is also moving, maybe at 200 miles per hour. But let's say relative to the fighter, you've got that 400 mile per hour crossing speed. The fighter is 500 yards away. That's 1,500 feet. Your bullet travels at 2,800 feet per second. So it takes about half a second for your bullet to reach where the fighter is right now. But in that half second, the fighter has moved almost 300 feet. That's longer than a football field. If you aim directly at the aircraft, your bullets are going to pass behind it by 300 feet. You'll see your tracers arcing through empty air while the fighter flies through untouched and lights you up with cannon fire. Now imagine trying to do this calculation in your head while you're freezing, hypoxic, terrified, and being shot at, while your aircraft is bouncing around from turbulence and evasive maneuvers, while the fighter is not just moving in one direction, but also climbing, diving, rolling. The problem becomes almost impossible. Early in the war, nobody had really figured this out systematically. Some experienced gunners developed an intuition for it. They'd aim ahead of the target. But it was guesswork. There was no standard training, no method, just hope and prayer and instinct. The British had been working on the problem longer, since they'd been in the war since 1939. They developed some training methods, gun cameras, practice shoots at towed targets, but their doctrine was still pretty basic. Aim ahead. How far? Well, use your judgment. Not exactly scientific. The British approach was to train gunners using a method called the ring and bead sight. You had a circular ring on your gun sight, and you were supposed to estimate how many rings ahead of the target you needed to aim. A fighter crossing at 90 degrees might need 2 rings of lead. A fighter coming straight at you needed no lead at all. But a fighter at a 45-degree angle at 300 yards while both of you are maneuvering? Good luck figuring that out. Some British gunners got good at it, really good. But it took dozens of missions to develop that kind of intuition, and most gunners didn't survive long enough to get that experience. The learning curve was written in blood. The Americans came into the war late, December 1941, and at first they just copied what everyone else was doing. But the American military culture had something different baked into it. An obsession with standardization, with systems, with turning everything into a repeatable process that any soldier could learn. The American military had a philosophy that came from the Industrial Revolution. If you can break down a complex task into simple steps, you can train anyone to do it. Henry Ford had proven this with automobile assembly. The Army Air Forces wanted to do the same thing with aerial gunnery. The Army Air Forces looked at the gunnery problem and said, we need to solve this with math and training, not just intuition.
They brought in mathematicians, physicists, engineers, people who could break down exactly what was happening in a high-speed engagement and turn it into something teachable. One of the key figures in this was a mathematician named Ladislas Farrago. He was working with the Army Air Forces analyzing combat footage and mission reports. He noticed patterns. When gunners hit targets, they weren't doing it randomly. There were specific conditions that led to kills, specific angles, specific ranges, specific deflection amounts. Farrago and his team started building models. They used high-speed cameras to film practice shoots. They analyzed every frame. They measured the exact position of the gun, the target, and where the bullets actually went. They built mathematical formulas that predicted the correct aim point based on all the variables. What they figured out changed everything. The key breakthrough was understanding that human reaction time and perception created a predictable delay. When you see a target, your brain takes time to process it. Your muscles take time to move the gun. Your finger takes time to pull the trigger. All this together creates about a quarter to half a second of delay between when you decide to shoot and when the gun actually fires. During that delay, the target is still moving. So even if you correctly calculated where to aim, by the time you actually shoot, you need to be aiming even further ahead. This is where the magic happened. But there was another factor that nobody had really accounted for. The human brain is actually pretty good at tracking moving objects. When early humans were hunting animals, they had to predict where a running deer would be and throw a spear to intercept it. That ability is hardwired into our brains. When you see something moving, your eyes automatically track it and predict where it's going. This is great for everyday life. It's how you catch a ball. It's how you avoid getting hit by a car. But in aerial gunnery, this automatic tracking was causing problems because gunners would consciously try to lead the target, but their brain was already unconsciously leading it. The result was they'd aim too far ahead. They'd overshoot. Bullets would fly in front of the target, still a miss. The solution was to teach gunners to aim at a point that felt wrong, that felt like they were aiming behind where the target was going to be. But when you factored in the unconscious tracking, the reaction time delay, and the bullet travel time, that behind aim point was actually perfect. It was psychological judo, using the brain's automatic systems against themselves to achieve accuracy. The training program had to overcome every instinct a gunner had. Imagine being told that everything you think you know about shooting is wrong, that you need to aim at a spot that looks like it's going to miss, that you need to trust a system that makes no sense to your gut. The instructors at gunnery school had their work cut out for them. They were dealing with kids mostly, 18, 19, 20-year-old guys who maybe had shot a hunting rifle before. Now they had to turn these kids into expert marksmen who could hit a target moving at hundreds of miles per hour while they themselves were also moving at hundreds of miles per hour. But it wasn't just about where to aim. It was about when to shoot. American doctrine developed something called the deflection shot technique with optimal firing windows. They calculated that there were specific moments during an attack run where you had the highest probability of a kill. Shooting too early meant the fighter could see your tracers and maneuver. Shooting too late meant you were already taking fire. There was a sweet spot. Usually when the fighter was between 300 and 500 yards out, committed to their attack run, unable to break off without losing their firing solution. This required incredible discipline. Picture a fighter screaming toward you at 400 miles per hour. Every instinct says, shoot now, shoot as soon as you can. But the training said, wait, let him get closer, closer, now. American gunners were trained to hold their fire, watch the fighter come in, wait, and then fire a concentrated burst at exactly the right moment with exactly the right lead. This was completely different from the spray and pray approach that most gunners used. This was precision shooting under the worst possible conditions. The training program for this was intense. Gunners spent weeks at specialized schools. They used skeet shooting to develop the instinct for leading targets. They practiced on clay pigeons launched at high speed from multiple angles. This wasn't just for fun. Skeet shooting at a championship level requires leading targets by several feet. It trains the same skills needed for aerial gunnery. They used moving platforms to simulate the motion of the bomber. They'd mount a gun on a truck bed and shoot at targets while the truck was driving. Then they'd put the truck on rough roads to simulate turbulence. The gunners had to learn to compensate for not just the target's motion, but their own platform's motion. They studied silhouettes of German and Japanese aircraft until they could identify them instantly at any angle. This was crucial because different aircraft had different speeds and turning characteristics. A Focke-Wulf 190 attacked differently than a Messerschmitt 110. A Zero moved differently than an Oscar. Gunners needed to recognize the aircraft type instantly and adjust their deflection accordingly. They learned the speeds and turning characteristics of every enemy fighter type. They memorized deflection angles. They practiced until the calculations became automatic. The goal was to make the gunner's response as reflexive as possible. See target, identify type, estimate range and angle, apply correct lead, fire. The training program for this was intense. Gunners spent weeks at specialized schools. They used skeet shooting to develop the instinct for leading targets. They practiced on clay pigeons launched at high speed from multiple angles. This wasn't just for fun. Skeet shooting at a championship level requires leading targets by several feet. It trains the same.
The results were absolutely devastating for the enemy. By mid-1943, when the new training methods and doctrines were fully implemented, American bomber gunners became the most lethal defensive weapon in the sky. Loss rates for bombers started dropping. Kill claims from gunners started skyrocketing. German fighter pilots, who had been feasting on British bombers, started running into American formations and getting shredded. The Luftwaffe lost experienced pilots who simply couldn't believe how accurate the defensive fire had become. Tactics that had worked for years suddenly became suicide. There's a famous account from a German pilot who attacked a formation of B-17s in late 1943. He came in from below and behind, a classic approach that had worked dozens of times before. He expected the usual spray of poorly aimed tracers that he could easily avoid. Instead, he flew into a wall of precisely aimed .50 caliber rounds. His wingman exploded. His own aircraft took multiple hits. He barely made it back to base. In his report, he said the Americans must have developed some new secret weapon. He couldn't believe that regular gunners had gotten that good. But they had. The statistics prove it. In 1942, it took an average of about 3,000 rounds fired to achieve one aerial victory. By late 1943, that number had dropped to under 1,000 rounds per kill. Gunners were 3 times more effective. And that's being conservative. Some sources put the improvement even higher. The ammunition savings alone were significant. Each B-17 carried about 7,000 rounds total for all positions. In the early days, a gunner might fire off all his ammunition in 2 or 3 engagements without hitting anything. With the new techniques, that same amount of ammunition could result in multiple kills. This meant bombers could defend themselves through longer missions without running out of ammo. Some individual gunners became absolute legends. Staff Sergeant Michael A. Ruth was credited with 17 confirmed kills. Technical Sergeant Forrest Vossler got 14 kills in a single mission and won the Medal of Honor. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner claimed 19 kills. These weren't lucky shots. This was trained skill combined with a superior technique. The story of Forrest Vossler is particularly incredible. During a mission over France in December 1943, his B-17 was attacked by multiple fighters. A 20mm cannon shell exploded in his radio compartment, severely wounding him and destroying one of his eyes. Despite this, he continued to man his gun and shot down multiple attacking fighters. He then repaired a damaged radio while bleeding heavily
and helped navigate the crippled bomber back to England. The accuracy that allowed him to score kills while half-blind came from training so thorough it was almost automatic. These ace gunners weren't superhuman. They were regular guys who had been trained in a superior method and had the experience to apply it under pressure. The fact that so many gunners achieved ace status proves the technique worked. In World War I, becoming a fighter ace was rare. In World War II, bomber gunners were doing it from defensive positions. The Japanese faced the same problem in the Pacific. Their Zero fighters were fast and maneuverable but lightly armored. When they started running into B-29 superfortresses with well-trained gunners using computing sights, the results were catastrophic. Zeros would disintegrate under concentrated .50 caliber fire. Japanese pilots started refusing to attack certain formations because the defensive fire was too accurate. The B-29 was even more advanced than the B-17. It had remote-controlled turrets that a gunner could operate from a central fire control station. The computing sites were integrated into the fire control system. A single gunner could control multiple turrets, directing concentrated fire at a single target. The accuracy was phenomenal. Japanese pilots developed a healthy respect, bordering on fear, for B-29 formations. There are intercepted radio transmissions where Japanese pilots are warning each other about the defensive fire. Some pilots would break off attacks rather than press through the hail of accurately aimed bullets. This psychological impact was almost as important as the physical kills. The psychological impact was huge. If you're a fighter pilot and you know that attacking a bomber formation has a serious chance of getting you killed, you hesitate. Maybe you don't commit as hard to your attack run. Maybe you break off earlier. Maybe you decide not to attack at all. That hesitation means the bombers get through. The mission succeeds. German pilots started developing new tactics specifically to counter American gunnery. They tried head-on attacks, where the closing speed was so high that even good deflection shooting was difficult. They tried standing off and using rockets. They tried attacking out of the sun, where gunners couldn't see them. But all these tactics were less effective than the simple high-speed pass that had worked so well against British bombers. The Luftwaffe's tactical evolution was essentially them trying to find ways to avoid getting shot by bombers. That's a huge strategic victory for the defensive gunnery doctrine. Instead of bombers trying to avoid fighters, fighters were trying to avoid bombers. And that was whole point. The goal wasn't just to shoot down fighters, the goal was to make the bombing mission survivable, to make sure the strategic bombing campaign could continue, to break the enemy's ability to stop Allied air power. It worked. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had essentially lost the battle over Germany. Not because they ran out of planes, they kept building fighters until the end of the war. German production of fighters actually increased through 1944, but because they couldn't stop the bombers. The losses they took attacking bomber formations were unsustainable. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could train new ones. The Germans had plenty of aircraft. What they didn't have was pilots who could survive long enough to become effective. The training pipeline couldn't keep up. And a big reason for that was American defensive gunnery. Every fighter that went down taking on a bomber formation was one less experienced pilot, one more green replacement who would be even easier to shoot down. A huge part of that was American gunnery doctrine, the technique of aiming behind to hit ahead, the computing gun sights, the intensive training. All of it combined to create a defensive system that was nearly impossible to overcome. The numbers tell the story. In 1943, the 8th Air Force flew over 88,000 sorties and lost about 3,000 bombers. That's a loss rate of about 3.4% per sortie. High, but sustainable. In the first half of 1944, the sortie count increased dramatically, but the loss rate dropped to under 2%. More missions, fewer losses. That's the definition of winning. By the time of D-Day in June 1944, Allied air superiority over Europe was complete. German fighters rarely contested daylight bombing raids. The bomber streams flew with near impunity. The strategic bombing campaign destroyed German oil production, crippled their transportation network, and devastated their industrial capacity. And the bombers were able to do this because they could defend themselves effectively.
So what's the big lesson here? The thing that seems completely backwards was actually the key to victory. American gunners in World War II learned to fight their own instincts. They learned to aim at a point that felt wrong, that looked wrong, that every fiber of their being said was incorrect. And by doing that, they became twice as deadly as anyone else in the sky. This wasn't about better equipment, though that helped. This wasn't about braver men, though they were incredibly brave. This was about understanding the science of what was actually happening, breaking it down, figuring out the real problem, and then developing a solution that worked even if it felt weird. The deflection shooting technique was based on math, physics, and psychology. It accounted for bullet travel time, target movement, human reaction delays, unconscious tracking behavior. All of it came together in a training program that turned average soldiers into expert marksmen in the most difficult shooting environment imaginable. The American approach to the problem shows something important about how they fought the war. They didn't just rely on courage and determination. They applied scientific thinking to military problems. They analyzed, they experimented, they tested, they refined, and then they trained everyone to the same standard. This was total war fought with industrial efficiency. The same mindset that built tanks and ships on assembly lines was applied to training soldiers. Break down the complex task, create a repeatable process, train to that process, execute. It worked. And the results speak for themselves. Thousands of enemy aircraft shot down. Tens of thousands of bomber crew lives saved. Strategic bombing missions that succeeded instead of failed. The whole course of the air war changed because someone figured out that aiming behind was actually aiming ahead. The human cost of not solving this problem would have been enormous. If American bombers had continued suffering the loss rates of early 1942 through the rest of the war, tens of thousands more airmen would have died. The strategic bombing campaign might have failed entirely. The war could have lasted longer. The atomic bomb might have been the only way to force a German surrender. But instead, smart people figured out the problem and solved it. And young men who trusted that solution survived battles they shouldn't have survived, came home to their families, lived long lives, all because someone taught them to aim wrong to shoot right. It's a perfect example of how modern warfare is about systems and science as much as courage and skill. You can have the bravest soldiers in the world, but if they're using the wrong technique, they'll lose. You need both, the courage to fight and the knowledge to fight effectively. This principle applies beyond just World War II. Throughout history, the side that fights smarter usually beats the side that just fights harder. Technology matters, training matters, doctrine matters. Understanding the science behind what you're doing matters. Courage is necessary, but not sufficient. The legacy of this technique didn't end with World War II either. Modern aircraft gun systems still use the same basic principle. Fire control computers automatically calculate deflection angles and lead. Fighter pilots learn deflection shooting using the same fundamental concepts. The technology has advanced, but the physics hasn't changed. Modern fighters use radar-guided guns with computing systems that make the World War II equipment look like toys. But the principle is identical. The computer measures target speed, direction, and range. It calculates where the target will be when the bullets arrive. It aims the gun at that point. The pilot just has to keep the target in the aiming reticle. Even missiles use similar logic. When you fire a heat-seeking missile at an aircraft, the missile doesn't fly directly at where the aircraft is. It flies a lead pursuit course, intercepting where the aircraft will be. The guidance system is constantly calculating deflection angles and adjusting the flight path. Same principle, different application. Even today, if you're shooting at a moving target from a moving platform, you need to aim at where the target is going to be, not where it is. Whether that's an aircraft, a ship, or anything else, the principle is eternal. And it all came together in the skies over Europe and the Pacific when American gunners learned to trust the math instead of their eyes. Naval gunnery uses deflection shooting. Anti-aircraft systems use it. Tank gunners shooting at moving targets use it. Anytime you're shooting at something that's moving, deflection matters. The speeds in aerial combat just made it more obvious and more critical. That counterintuitive technique, that backwards aiming method, helped win the air war. It protected the bomber crews who destroyed German industry and Japanese military capability. It made strategic bombing possible. And it showed that sometimes the answer to an impossible problem is to do the exact opposite of what seems obvious. The broader lesson is about trusting science over instinct. Human instincts evolved for a specific environment. Running across the African savanna, throwing rocks at animals. Those instincts are great for that environment, but put a human in a metal tube 6 miles up moving at 300 miles per hour, and those instincts don't work anymore. The gunners who survived were the ones who could override their instincts, who could trust the training, who could aim at a spot that looked wrong and squeeze the trigger anyway. That's incredibly difficult to do. Your brain is screaming at you that you're about to miss, but you do it anyway because the math says it works. This same principle applies in modern aviation. Pilots have to trust their instruments, even when their inner ear is telling them they're right side up and the instruments say they're inverted. Trusting the instruments over your senses keeps you alive. Same concept. The men who climbed into those gun turrets and flew into the teeth of enemy fighters using a technique that felt wrong were heroes. They trusted their training. They trusted the science. They did their job under conditions that most people can't even imagine. Freezing cold, oxygen deprivation, terror. And they did it mission after mission until the war was won. Think about the daily reality of being a bomber gunner. You wake up at 3 in the morning. You put on layers of clothing because you're going to spend 8 hours in an environment colder than any freezer. You climb into a cramped metal turret where you can barely move. You put on an oxygen mask because human lungs don't work at 30,000 feet. You're strapped yourself in knowing that if the aircraft gets hit, you might not be able to get out. Then you fly for hours. Sometimes the trip to the target was 4 hours. That's 4 hours of sitting in that frozen turret, watching the sky, waiting for enemy fighters. Your hands are numb, even with the heated gloves. Your face is frozen, even with the oxygen mask. You're breathing pure oxygen, which dries out your throat and nose. You're probably dealing with the effects of hypoxia because the oxygen systems weren't perfect. And then the fighters come, and you have maybe 30 seconds to identify them, estimate range and deflection, aim, and fire. And if you miss, they're going to hit you with 20mm cannon shells that will tear your turret apart. And then more fighters come, and you do it again and again for the entire mission. The physical and mental demands were incredible. The cold alone was enough to incapacitate people. Frostbite was common. Hypoxia causes confusion and poor judgment. Fear is exhausting, and you had to do all this while performing complex calculations and executing precise motor control. The fact that these guys could do their jobs at all is impressive. The fact that they could do them well enough to achieve the kill rates they did is extraordinary. The training that made that possible deserves recognition. And think about the instructors who developed and taught these techniques. They were taking combat lessons learned at tremendous cost and turning them into training programs that saved lives. Every successful student was potentially dozens of crew members who would survive missions because the defensive gunnery worked. The feedback loop was crucial. Combat reports would come back describing what worked and what didn't. The The training schools would adjust their curriculum. New techniques would be tested. The ones that worked would be standardized. The ones that didn't would be discarded. This constant refinement meant the training kept getting better throughout the war. By 1945, American aerial gunnery training was the best in the world. Other Allied nations sent their gunners to American schools to learn the techniques. The doctrine was adopted by other air forces. The computing sites were shared with allies. The American method became the standard.
If you want more stories about World War II tactics that changed history, check out the next video.